Chapter 24. Mom pulled out the papers and unfolded them. She placed them on the table and slid her hands across the pages to smooth them out. She peered close at the first page and then sat back, putting her hands over it, as if she couldn't quite handle what might be there. She leaned close and put her hand on Mom's. "Want me to read it?" Mom nodded, closing her eyes. So Cass hunched over the pages and began to read aloud, in that voice that felt like part herself and part something bigger. "Dear Denise Jane Foster, I am writing to tell you the story of your mother. This letter is based on conversations we had before she passed away. She helped so many people during her life, and we, in turn, have tried to help her by finding you at last." Mom slid a hand around Cass's shoulders. Her fingers were cold. Cass reached up and took Mom's hands as if she could thaw it out by holding it. "Go on," Mom said softly. Cass leaned close to the page again. "You may have wondered about your own culture and heritage. You may have felt like you didn't have any. That is not true. We would like to give them back to you now. Your mother was born on the—" Cass's eyes scanned ahead and she gasped. "What?" Mom said, but Cass's heart was beating so fast suddenly that she couldn't answer, and her heart was like drums that had been waiting for a long time. Mom gently took the pages. "Your mother was born on the reservation just outside the city. She was Cayuga by birth. You may not know what that means. The Cayuga are one of North America's First Nations. They are Iroquois. They have a long and proud history, and you are part of that. We would like you to know that you have roots going back thousands of years in this place." "Cayuga," said Mom, trying the word out in her mouth. "Iroquois, so she was native?" The truth was dawning on Cass, faltering like she was just learning to walk. If Mom's mom was Cayuga, then it meant. The drums were pounding joy, and the voices were raised now in victory. Mom and Cass, they were coming back. Cass took the pages and began to read again. "Your mother lived on the reservation until she was 6 years old. Her mother had passed away, and her father raised her as best he could, which was not really very well. The trouble was that he had been forced when he was a little boy to go to a terrible place where he had forgotten what it was like to have a father, so he couldn't imagine how to be a father. He also tried to find ways to escape his pain, which were not very good ones. That was a very hard thing for everyone. Then your mother was also taken from her home and sent to one of those nightmare places to live. It was called a residential school. The government said that its purpose was to take the Indian out of the child. The government and the churches did not think our culture should be part of the country. They tried to get rid of it by taking it away from the children. Your mother was beaten there and starved and tormented. Everything was taken away from her, even the words in her mouth. She was punished if she spoke her own language. She learned that her traditions were bad. She learned that if she was to survive, she must be trained to do jobs that would suit her for being a worker in a white society. She must be trained not to be herself." Cass was dizzy with all the truths that was suddenly all around her. She thought of her dreams of those terrified children trapped in that place. Her grandmother had been one of those children, and her great-grandfather. That was what the mask had been trying to tell her. It was making sure they hadn't forgotten. It was passing their stories to Cass. "The bullies," Cass said, her hands in fists. It seemed like the whole world was nothing but bullies and victims, and nobody could escape being one or the other. Not her grandmother, not Mom, not Cass or Deegan or Ellis. Not even the government of her own country. Orenda and Octkon, two forces, and Octkon won over and over. She continued to read out loud. "When she was 17, they finally set your mother free. But now she did not know anything about herself. She had forgotten how to speak to her family because she didn't know their language anymore. She had almost forgotten what a family even was. She did not know how to be a daughter, and she had no idea about what mothers and fathers were supposed to do either. She had learned that white ways were the real ways, that everything else was fake. She had no solid earth under her, and she could barely stand. She was a toddler staggering in a world that didn't make any sense. You can see that this was a terrible thing. It separated her from herself, and she was lost for a very long time. She had nothing to tell her what was right, and like her father before her, she discovered a half world of drinking and drugs that might help her to not think about herself. She did not respect herself. In fact, she hated herself. During that time, she found out that she was going to have a baby. She was barely out of her teens. She was living on the city streets now, having left the reservation. Mom shook her head, hand to her mouth. Poor girl, she said. The drums pounded louder. Your mother could not look after a baby living in alleys and on sidewalks, exposing you to so many dark things. And so after you were born, she took you to the hospital and placed you in an armchair in the lobby, wrapped in a towel. She didn't leave a note. From there, you were made a ward of the Crown, and you entered a foster home, the first of many for you. We now know about what these places were like for you. We learned, and then we walked them with you in empathy. We have heard you. Who's we? Mom said. Cass shook her head, puzzled. Maybe it was generations of ancestors reaching out to recover all those who had been lost. Maybe it was all of those voices who had been singing together inside of her, even since the mask had introduced her to the Orenda. Maybe it was the children in those schools. Or maybe it was something else, something she couldn't imagine yet. Your mother was too ashamed to go home, too ashamed to tell anyone what she had done. But when word finally reached her that her father had died, it pierced through the haze she lived in. It shocked her into grieving at last. She went back to the reservation then. She entered the house she had lived in. Her room had not changed, as if her father had expected her home any day. She wandered through the house, trying to feel any sense of connection to it. On the wall in her room, she saw the mask that had always been hung there, carved by her grandfather. He was a member of the False Face Society, and that mask was used in ceremonies for healing. She took the mask with her. Cass and Mom stared at each other. Your mask? Mom said. Your mother was faced with a choice, to continue in her destructive ways or to seek a means to heal herself. Your mother bravely chose healing. She did not know how to do this, though, so she traveled in search of answers, working as she went to make enough money to continue her quest. She visited other countries and sought out quiet, holy places. She learned to meditate. She studied about great religions and explored what it felt like to practice them. When she finally came home, she was ready to look at her own traditions, the spiritual ways of her own people. Humbly, she asked the knowledge keepers to teach her. So she began her journey back to herself. As she learned more and more about herself and her people, she thought more and more about you. She contacted the Children's Aid to ask where you were. They were not helpful, for she had no proof of being your mother. She tried exploring on her own. She followed leads, found possible foster homes where you had been. Each was a dead end, but she continued to search. At the same time, she went back to school. She earned scholarships to go to college, and from there to university. Eventually, she earned a degree in social work. Cass said, squeezing Mom's hand. That's what you're doing. You're going back to school, too. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, said Mom. I haven't even signed up yet, and we aren't made of money. But you will. Yes, maybe I will, Mom said softly. Cass read on. Your mother wanted to help other people who were like herself, women who had lost the ways of their traditions, children of those schools grown up now, lost in the cities. She wanted to help them restore them to themselves. She could see that this was to be her job. So when she was able to, she founded a place for them. It is called the Turtle Island Healing Center. It is in this city. Cass flung down the papers. I know that place. I walked by it with Deegan. Her grandmother had founded it. Suddenly, the amazing truth was dawning on her. The journey she had taken, first in her dream and then with Deegan, had been about much more than simply finding the mask. It had been about trying to help her find everything. Mom took the papers now and read on. Your mother made the Turtle Island Healing Center as a refuge for all who were hurting. As time went on, she gathered other people to help her. They provided classes in traditional ways, offered aid to those in crisis, helped to build skills necessary for finding jobs. They taught about what it was to be a parent and to be a child. And during all of this time, the mask hung on the wall of her office. It reminded her of her own past. It reminded her of her grandfather and of her father and of the many children who grew into fathers and mothers without having had any. You were one of the children she thought of often. When she became ill, she made a will. In it, she left her house and her little savings to you. even though she did not know where you were. And then she passed away. You cannot even begin to imagine the outpouring of grief. We were united in our love for her, those of us who had come, broken through those open doors, and those of us who had stood by her side and reached out to the ones who thought they were forever lost. It was a long time before we decided upon a fitting tribute to her, but when we did, it seemed so simple and so obvious. We must find you. It was not easy. We knew it wouldn't be, but we were a network of people, not simply one person. Through your mother, we had built roots and connections that spread out in all directions, interlocking and crisscrossing. Although we might have come to the healing center broken, we'd gone from there to build many kinds of lives. Among us were lawyers, police, and indeed social workers within the very Children's Aid itself, who all assisted in our search. In the end, we found you, of course. One of us, now a lawyer, met with you and arranged everything. Others cleaned your mother's house and got it ready for you. We put your mother's story in this letter and sealed it. Finally, we decided to put your mother's mask in the house. We chose not to hang it on the wall, as you did not yet understand its significance. Instead, we placed it quietly in a drawer. It is a sacred thing. And now you know the main facts. Maybe that's all you will want to know, or maybe you'll be curious to find out more. Please be assured that we will never seek to contact you or influence you in any way. If you are interested in reaching out to us, however, we will always be here for you. Cass and Mom sat silently, the letter lying on the table between them. Mom's eyes were wide in the candlelight, taking in everything, trying to make sense of it. She tried to find me, she said at last. Then her eyes glistened with tears, and I pawned her mask? If you hadn't, Cass whispered, the drum still beating inside her, we would never have found out. Just then, there was a soft knock on the door.